Alleluia, alleluia, alleluia. Hallelujah, hallelujah. The Spirit you received is the Spirit of songs, and it makes us cry out, Abba, Father. Hallelujah, hallelujah, hallelujah. The Lord be with you.
And with your spirit.
A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Luke.
Glory to you, O Lord.
Jesus was praying in a certain place, and when he ceased, one of his disciples said to him, Lord, teach us to pray, as John taught his disciples. And he said to them, when you pray, say, Father, hallowed be thy name, thy kingdom come. Give us each day our daily bread, and forgive us our sins, for we ourselves forgive everyone who is indebted to us, and lead us not into temptation. The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ.
In August of 1974, I arrived at La Trappe for a month during the long vac, and the novice master said, l'essentiel c'est de savoir prier, and he gave me a book entitled Seigneur, apprends-nous à prier, taken from this gospel. Lord, teach us to pray. It was by a well-known abbot whom later on I met, Don André Louf, who was abbot at Montdescartes in the north of France, from which eventually the next abbot of La Trappe came. The prior of that house was given to us as abbot eventually. But the book contained the whole teaching of the abbot given to his community on all aspects of the contemplative life, even in great depth. And it indicated the power of French spirituality, where things were taken very seriously and consequences followed, such as silence, the intensity of the interior life, the care given to the cult, and the structure which held as a body. And so it is that one is carried on by a wave of fervour. Indeed, I remember hearing this comment from the novice master years later, that the community was actually more fervent at that time than it had been earlier on, when the fullness of penance was such that it could actually bring down the health of the community. Be that as it may, there was a certain oomph, as we would say, in the air, and it was good to see. Indeed, there were so many of us in formation at the time that we were able to put on for big events like the Abbot's Feast Day, bits of theatre or whatever it might be, and it was interesting to see the hidden coming out to the surface. Now, we were close to another monastery which was very important. It was that of the Little Flower, of which Dom Marie Bernard had been. She had been, for Lee, as I had said earlier, the spiritual daughter of our own, by then very elderly, Dom Marie Bernard, Mother Agnes of the manuscript. And there was that feeling between the two communities. You would often speak of the spirituality of Therese and give it us in chapter. the wave of interior life in France was to be detected also in what was going on around. There were beatifications going on, and I remember at the time we had beatified Elizabeth of the Trinity, who had died at the age of 26, for only 2 more years of life than the little flower herself. They were both hidden Carmelites, and Elizabeth of the Trinity gave to the Church a great spirituality of the indwelling, that is, the Trinity living in us, and the soul as a temple of God, and the consequences following with regard to the attention given to that indwelling guest. But there is also another one who has been coming on track in the period following all that, essentially since John Paul II became Pope. It's the way in which the forgotten Faustina came back into the open. He pulled her out of the drawer where she could have remained in oblivion, but he knew of her importance coming from that same area. And Krakow is a place where much spirituality has come out of, and we know also how things would happen in the context of Divine Mercy. She also had a short life. She was only born around 1904 and she died in 1938. The exact dates I have here. She 1905 in Krakow, and she died just as the war was about to break out in 1938. And of course she did have prophecies as regards destruction of monasteries and convents before she died. Poland after this had a terrible, terrible time, eaten up by both ends, Russians on one side and Germans on the other. They put up a brave fight. Now, with regard to this particular now saint, she was then only sister, things came out bit by bit. At one time there was a man from Turin who was sitting in a wheelchair completely handicapped, but he had an image of the Divine Mercy, and John Paul II went up to him and said, "How can you be sad with the Divine Mercy with you? Pray to my Faustina and you will be healed." And he did. He prayed to this icon which he had, and the icon came alive. The Lord came out of the icon, healed him completely, and he went round afterwards giving his testimony. But such stories also had an effect in getting her quickly moved. But John Paul II himself was one of the interesting cases in question. With regard to the persecution that he was coming out of, he knew all about it, and when this Lithuanian nun came out of nowhere, he went straight towards her. Now, what had happened to this Lithuanian nun was that she was in prison for a long time. She was also very badly treated in prison, and at a certain point she was exposed to very dangerous rays, which meant that she was by then completely riddled in cancer and that had no hope of survival. But she found her way somehow to the Holy Father, and he went up to her and embraced her warmly, and she felt something at that point, and a great miracle happened. Her whole body, riddled in cancer, was completely cleared of cancer, and she was healed. So even before he died, John Paul II had power. And so it's not surprising that the intuition to make this spirituality of the Divine Mercy for our time available to the whole people of God, and also following through the wishes of heaven that this Sunday, following the octave, at the end of the octave of Easter, should be proclaimed that of Divine Mercy, and it happens to follow well the Gospel given for that day, and also the collect. And this then is what we have, the whole spirituality, which comes through also in the homily that he gave at the canonization, which is read on the feast itself if one celebrates it liturgically. He quotes in his homily how the Lord himself said to Sister Faustina, "Homines nullam quietem invenient," men will find no rest donec ad misericordiam meam cum fiducia vertantur, until they come to my mercy with, now fiducia is confidence and trust, which rejoins the spirituality precisely of the little flower. So we find there these things meeting, and we notice also that there are great similarities in what the Lord gave much earlier in time, at the end of the 1600s, at Paris Le Monial, with the showing of the flames of his divine mercy in the heart specifically, and how this heart was on fire with love and yet surrounded with thorns, wounded by the sins of men, by their indifference and coldness. And that coldness was what he came to heal by the flames of love, showing that he was an intimate friend and wanting friendship. Jansenism damaged the church in many parts of Europe, especially France, and it was such a tremendous thing to come to the Lord in Holy Communion that people had a fear to do so. So in asking for a monthly communion, he was already asking a lot more than was happening at the time. He therefore is the God who wants the intimacy of his followers, and not such a fear and trembling that they cannot approach. He is not in the first instance the policeman of the soul. He is the saviour of the soul, and the spouse eventually of those who give themselves completely to him. This then is a question of relationship rather than religion. And we have another one in the same context, who is now also, I believe, honoured publicly on the altar of the church. It's her spiritual father, and there are wonderful words the Lord had to say about him, which we find in the diary. It's Father Sopocco. So we have this entry in the diary on August the 30th. Reverend Father Sopocco left this morning when I was steeped in a prayer of thanksgiving for the great grace that I had received from God, namely that of seeing Father. I became united in a special way with the Lord, who said to me, "He is a priest after my own heart. His efforts are pleasing to me. You see, my daughter, that my will must be done, and that which I had promised you I shall do." Through him I spread comfort to suffering and care-worn souls. Through him it pleased me to proclaim the worship of my mercy, and through this work of mercy more souls will come close to me than otherwise would have, even if he had kept giving absolution day and night for the rest of his life, because by so doing he would have laboured only for as long as he lived, whereas, thanks to this work of mercy, he will be labouring till the end of the world. There is a special link between the Divine Mercy and the hour of the Passion. We're invited to pause at 3 o'clock, and many people actually do have some kind of alarm which goes off at that point, so that one is plugged into the full power of the moment when the Lord said, "It is accomplished," and all the grace is available at that point, because God is outside time, and so is Calvary. Especially when we think of the number of masses going on throughout the world all the time, Calvary present on earth until the end of the ages. But there is mercy, especially at the hour of death, and we're invited to use it when people are dying. There is an interesting case. It was what happened again in Poland, Auschwitz. There was a group of Jesuits who were captured, but their superior happened to be absent when the police arrived and took them. He gave himself up because he felt he ought to be with his community, went to the camp and to the commandant, explained who he was, and unexpectedly the commandant said to him, "Go and do something useful." And so he was allowed to return and ministered as a priest. Now, when it came to the Nuremberg trials, this commandant was, of course, up in the witness box, and he had to face the consequences of what had happened at Auschwitz. He did, and he was to be executed. And something moved him. He asked if he could see a priest, and no priest was willing at that point or available to come into that situation. So they looked around even more, and they found in the actual shrine of Divine Mercy, I believe at Krakow, a priest who turned out to be the very priest that he had sent back. And so he came and heard his confession, which lasted somewhere between an hour and a quarter and an hour and a half, and he went with peace in his soul into eternity, hanged. I'll make a little parenthesis. The official executioner in England for years, Alfred Pierpoint, who also did one or two in Dublin, thought it was a dreadful way that they were being hanged in Nuremberg, because he knew how to do it and they didn't seem to do it properly. They prolonged their suffering quite often unnecessarily, but that's just a little parenthesis. He himself maintained it was the least violent way of dying if it was done properly. I close that parenthesis, but just to be aware that actually mercy reaches those who humanly are beyond redemption according to the mind of man, and we must have the same attitude. No one is beyond redemption, no matter what our interior reactions may be. There is nothing worse than the loss of an immortal soul. Eternity is a very long time. Some years ago, I was sent from Kilnaclough to nearby Mellifont for my retreat, and last minute novice master said the prior wants you to compose a hymn for the opening of the shrine, opening the shrine of Divine Mercy there at Kilnaclough. And I wasn't amused at that, but I didn't say anything. I just felt a bit frustrated because I wasn't there to do that. I wanted to pray. So I just went into prayer mode on my knees, and I pleaded with the then Sister Faustina, please give me something. I can't do this for myself. And out of the blue, just like that, words and lyrics came straight away. So I thought, thank you. That was, in a few seconds it all came and no time was wasted. So we can sing it. There is a place where peace and mercy meet, where humankind the rays of Godhead can in darkness greet, and healing find. There is a manhood where divinity looks out to us from all eternity. A stream of light, a beam of ancient grace, given in this hour for us who in this tender face behold the power, the time to time that in the moments be. I see this case and waiting long for me. O Master, draw me close to this soft heat, and melts in this the coldness of the heart where all things meet. Extend thy bliss, and in a smile bid me a watering deep, here where there is a place for those